Welcome back to HOA Outplayed. The permit was fine until she decided it was not. Barbara shoved a tow yard rate sheet toward my face and yelled that she loved the storage fees. "This is not getting ignored," she said, her voice loud enough to make the mail carrier stop and stare. I stood there with my gate fob in one hand, shaking. Because my car was 15 feet away with a wheel lift backing toward it, and I had about 10 minutes before the tow yard closed, and my entire custody schedule collapsed. I work nights as an EMT dispatcher in Boise, Idaho, which means I cannot miss calls, and I cannot afford to lose my vehicle for even one shift. The Meadowbrook HOA Incorporated had been circling me for 3 weeks now, inventing violations out of nothing, and Barbara Moore, the community standards chair, had decided I was her personal project. She stood in front of my car with that rate sheet, a stack of orange cones strapped together with a clip hanging from her shoulder, and her pixie-cut dark brown hair catching the late sun like she was posing for a poster about neighborhood tyranny. "I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized," Barbara said, tapping the rate sheet with one finger. "We can tow first and explain later. That is how enforcement works." The tow truck driver glanced at me, then at Barbara, clearly waiting for someone to make a decision. I could see chalk marks on my tires, fresh white streaks that had not been there this morning, and I knew she had walked onto my driveway to make them while I was inside, getting ready for my shift. Barbara had called this a guest pass violation. She claimed my contractor friend who had stopped by yesterday afternoon to drop off tools had parked illegally, even though he had a valid guest pass on his dashboard and he was only there for 20 minutes. The pass system was simple. Residents could print guest passes from the HOA portal, good for 72 hours, and display them on the dash. My friend had done exactly that. But Barbara had decided the pass was expired because she said the clock on the portal was wrong, and therefore the timestamp was invalid. That was her opening move. The escalation came 2 days later when she showed up at my door with a deputy and 2 neighbors she called backup, holding a tablet and announcing she was documenting trespass behavior because my gate fob had malfunctioned, and she claimed that proved I was bypassing security. The gate had glitched, sure. It glitched for everyone. But Barbara treated it like I had hacked the system and was sneaking vehicles in after hours. She stood on my walkway, recording me with her phone, asking loaded questions designed to make me look defensive on camera. I let her talk herself into a corner that night. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I just asked her to put her concerns in writing and email them to the board, which she refused to do because she said verbal warnings were faster. The deputy told her she needed to step back off my property unless she had a formal complaint, and she left, but not before saying I should expect enforcement action within 24 hours. That was when I started gathering evidence. I pulled the security camera footage from my doorbell cam, which showed Barbara walking up my driveway at 6 in the morning 2 days earlier, bending down next to my tires, and drawing those chalk marks. I also had the timestamps from my contractor friend, who had photos of his truck in my driveway with the guest pass clearly visible through the windshield. The metadata on those photos matched the guest pass issue time from the HOA portal, which I screenshot before Barbara could claim the portal was wrong again. But I did not show any of that yet. I let the meeting move on, because my move was not a speech, it was a document. I had something bigger, something that would flip the entire situation, but I needed the right moment. The tow yard closes at 6, and it was 5:40 now. If they took my car, I would miss my shift, which meant I would miss a custody exchange tomorrow morning, which meant my ex would file a motion, and I would spend the next month in court trying to undo the damage. Barbara knew that. She had asked enough questions about my schedule to know exactly how to hurt me. The mail carrier tried to get around the cones and the wheel lift in the lane, gave up, and reversed back toward the main road. Barbara did not move. She stood there with that rate sheet, her baseball cap black against the bright sky, and told me the storage fees started accruing immediately once the vehicle entered the yard. $50 a day, she said, plus the tow fee, plus the immobilization fee if they had to use a boot. She smiled when she said immobilization, like she had invented the word just for me. I pulled out my phone and showed her the timestamp on my doorbell footage. I said, "You were on my property at 6:02 in the morning marking my tires without permission. That is trespass." She blinked, then recovered fast. She said the HOA has right of access for enforcement purposes, which was not true, but she said it loud enough that the tow driver heard and hesitated. I said, "Show me that in the covenant." She said, "I do not need to show you anything. I am the chair." That was when I realized she was not actually following any rules. She was making them up as she went, using vague safety language to keep neighbors from questioning her. If someone asked why she was targeting me, she would say something about unregistered vehicles or unauthorized access or guest pass fraud, and people would assume I was guilty because who questions the community standards chair? It was a perfect little tyranny, and it had been running for months before I moved in. The twist came from an unexpected source. One of the board members, a quiet guy named Eric who lived 3 streets over, had been recording Barbara at the last meeting when she was bragging to another resident about how the HOA got a cut of the tow fees. He did not mean to catch it. He was just recording the meeting for his own notes because he missed a lot of the details in real time. But the audio was clear, Barbara saying the tow company gives us a percentage of the storage fees, so if we tow more vehicles we can fund more enforcement. It is a perfect cycle. Eric sent me that audio file 2 days ago. I had not told anyone I had it. I was saving it for the right moment, and that moment was coming fast. Barbara stepped closer, and I could smell her perfume mixed with the diesel exhaust from the tow truck. She said, "You can avoid all of this if you just pay the fine and admit the violation. $250, and we will call it resolved." I said, "What violation?" She said, "The expired guest pass and the gate bypass." I said the pass was valid and the gate malfunctioned. She said, "Prove it." So I did. I played the doorbell footage right there, volume up, so the tow driver could hear it too. The video showed Barbara on my driveway, crouching next to my car, pulling out a piece of chalk and marking my front passenger tire. The timestamp said 6:02 in the morning, 3 hours before she claimed the violation occurred. The tow driver looked at Barbara, then at me, then at his truck. He said, "I need authorization from the HOA in writing before I move this vehicle." Barbara said, "You have it. I called it in." He said, "I need it signed." She did not have it signed. The driver got back in his truck and pulled the lift away from my car. Barbara turned red, the kind of red that starts at the neck and climbs fast. She said, "This is not over. I will have this vehicle towed within the hour." I said, "You are going to have a hard time doing that when the board finds out you have been taking a cut of the tow fees." She froze. I did not play the audio yet. I just let her know I had it. That night I got an email from the HOA management company saying there would be an emergency board meeting the following evening to address recent enforcement complaints. The email did not name me, but I knew it was about me because Barbara had been complaining to the board president that I was interfering with enforcement. I replied to the email and said I would attend and I would be bringing documentation. The board met in the clubhouse, a squat building near the neighborhood entrance with a kitchenette and folding chairs. About 30 residents showed up, which was more than usual, because word had gotten around that Barbara was in trouble. She sat at the front table with the board president and 2 other board members, her stack of orange cones strapped together with a clip resting against the wall behind her. She avoided looking at me. The board president opened the meeting and said they had received several complaints about enforcement procedures, and they wanted to hear from affected residents. I raised my hand. He called on me. I stood up and said I had been targeted for 3 weeks over violations that did not exist, and I had evidence that the enforcement was being done for financial gain rather than safety. Barbara interrupted and said, "That is not true. I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized." I said, "Then why did you tell another resident that the HOA gets a cut of the tow fees?" The room went quiet. Barbara said, "I never said that." I pulled out my phone and said, "I have audio." She said, "You are lying." I pressed play. Eric had cleaned up the audio so it was perfectly clear, Barbara's voice saying the tow company gives us a percentage of the storage fees, so if we tow more vehicles we can fund more enforcement. It is a perfect cycle. The room stayed quiet for a long time. If you are enjoying this chaos, hit that like button and subscribe, because HOA drama only gets wilder from here. The board president looked at Barbara and said, "Is that your voice?" She said, "That is out of context." He said, "What context makes that acceptable?" She did not answer. One of the other board members, a woman named Jessica, said, "We need to see the contract with the tow company." Barbara said, "I do not have it with me." Jessica said, "Then we will table this until you produce it." Barbara said, "I do not answer to you." Jessica said, "You answer to the board, and I am on the board." That was when Barbara made her second mistake. She stood up and said, "I am not going to sit here and be attacked by someone who does not even follow the rules." She pointed at me and said, "He has been letting unauthorized vehicles into the neighborhood, he has been bypassing the gate, and he has been harassing me on my own property." I said, "I have never been on your property." She said, "You drove past my house and honked." I said, "I drive past your house because it is on the way to mine, and I have never honked." She said, "You are lying." I pulled out the second piece of evidence, a certified copy of the HOA records showing Barbara was 3 months behind on her own dues. I had requested it from the management company 2 weeks ago, and they had sent it because it was a public record for homeowners in good standing. Barbara was not in good standing. She owed $875, which meant she was technically not eligible to hold a board position under the HOA covenant. I handed the document to the board president and said, "She is not in good standing." He read it, then looked at Barbara. He said, "Is this accurate?" She said, "I have a payment plan." He said, "The covenant says board members must be current on dues." She said, "That is not enforced." He said, "It is now." Jessica leaned over and read the document, then said, "We need to vote on whether to remove her from the standards chair position." Barbara said, "You cannot do that." Jessica said, "We just did." The board voted 4-1 to remove Barbara as community standards chair immediately. The one vote against was from a guy who was clearly friends with Barbara and looked miserable about the whole thing. Barbara stood up, grabbed her stack of orange cones strapped together with a clip and tried to storm out. The board president said, "We are not finished." She turned around and said, "I am finished." He said, "We need a motion on the record to refund the towing and immobilization fees and clear the ledger for affected residents." Barbara said, "I am not making that motion." Jessica said, "I will make it." Another board member seconded it. They voted. It passed. Barbara tried to interrupt, but Jessica held up a hand and said, "You no longer have meeting chair privileges, which means you do not control the microphone." Barbara opened her mouth, closed it, then turned and walked out. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Someone in the back row started clapping, and then a few more people joined in, and then it was half the room. I sat down and tried not to smile too much. The board president said they would send a letter to the tow company terminating the contract and demanding an audit of all fees collected in the past 6 months. He also said they would open a formal review of all enforcement actions Barbara had authorized, and any that were found to be invalid would be reversed and refunded. I raised my hand again and said, "I have a list of other residents who were targeted." He said, "Send it to me tonight." I sent him the list. It had 11 names, all people who had been fined or towed in the past 4 months for things like expired guest passes, unauthorized vehicles, gate bypass, and fire lane violations that were not actually in fire lanes. Most of them had paid the fines because they did not want to fight. The board president emailed me back within an hour and said they would contact everyone on the list and start issuing refunds. The second set piece happened 3 days later at the USPS mailbox cluster near the neighborhood entrance. I was checking my mail when Barbara pulled up in her car, parked diagonally across 2 spaces, and got out holding a clipboard and her phone. She walked straight toward me and said, "I know you are behind this." I said, "Behind what?" She said, "The board turning against me." I said, "The board made their own decision based on the evidence." She said, "You manipulated them." I tried to walk past her, but she stepped in front of me and said, "You think you won, but this is not over." I said, "It is over. You are off the board." She said, "I can still make your life difficult." I said, "How?" She said, "I can file a complaint with the county about your contractor friend. I can report your gate fob as stolen. I can make sure every resident knows you are a troublemaker." I said, "You are threatening me in public with witnesses." She looked around and realized the mail carrier was standing 10 feet away, watching. The mail carrier pulled out his phone and said, "I am recording this." Barbara turned toward him and said, "You cannot record me without permission." He said, I am in public, I can record whatever I want. She said, I will report you to the post office. He said, go ahead, my supervisor already knows about you blocking the mail route. That was a reference to the day she had set up cones and a wheel lift in the lane and refused to move them. The post office had complained to the HOA, and the HOA had sent her a warning letter, which she had ignored. Barbara turned back to me and said, this is not over. I said, yes, it is. A sheriff deputy pulled up in a cruiser, parked behind Barbara's car, and got out. He walked over and said, someone called about a disturbance. The mail carrier said she was threatening him. The deputy looked at Barbara and said, is that true? She said, I was not threatening, I was informing. The deputy said, informing him of what? She said, that he is going to face consequences. The deputy said, that sounds like a threat. The deputy asked me if I wanted to file a complaint. I said yes. He wrote down the incident number on his notepad, tore off a slip, and handed it to me. Barbara said, this is ridiculous. I did not threaten anyone. The deputy said, you told him you would make his life difficult and that he would face consequences. She said, I meant through proper HOA channels. He said that is still a threat. He told her to go home and to stop contacting me or she could be charged with harassment. Barbara got in her car and drove off without saying anything else. The mail carrier gave me a thumbs up and went back to his route. The deputy stayed for a few more minutes, took my statement, and said I should keep a copy of the incident report in case Barbara tried anything else. I thanked him and walked back to my house, feeling like I had just survived a battle. The next week, the HOA sent out an email blast announcing that Barbara was no longer on the board and that the enforcement policies were under review. They also announced that residents could request refunds for any fines or tow fees issued in the past 6 months if they believed the enforcement was improper. The email did not name Barbara, but everyone knew who it was about. The neighborhood group chat exploded with messages, mostly people celebrating and a few people defending Barbara because they were her friends or they believed in strict enforcement. I got my refund 3 days later, $250 for the fake fine, plus $80 in processing fees, plus a formal apology letter from the board president. The letter said the HOA had reviewed my case and found no evidence of any violation, and they were clearing my record entirely. I framed the letter and hung it in my garage next to the doorbell footage printout. The contractor who had been targeted with the fake guest pass violation also got a refund and an apology. He called me and said he almost stopped coming to the neighborhood because he did not want to deal with Barbara anymore, but now he felt safe bringing his truck back. He also said he was thinking about filing a civil complaint against Barbara personally for harassment and defamation, and he asked if I wanted to join. I said I would think about it. The board hired a new management company to handle enforcement, and the new company immediately revised the guest pass policy to make it clearer and easier to use. They also installed new gate readers that did not glitch, and they sent out a memo saying that residents would no longer be penalized for equipment failures. The memo included a line that said enforcement actions must be based on documented violations with photo evidence and written authorization from the board, which effectively killed Barbara's ability to call tow trucks on a whim. Barbara tried to come back. She showed up at the next board meeting and asked to speak during the public comment period. The board president said she could have 3 minutes. She stood up and gave a speech about how the neighborhood was becoming lawless and how the new enforcement policies were too lenient and how she had only been trying to protect property values. She said, I am the reason this neighborhood stays civilized, and without strong enforcement we will have chaos. Jessica interrupted her and said, your 3 minutes are up. Barbara said, I am not finished. Jessica said, yes you are. Barbara sat down and the board moved on to the next item. She did not come back to another meeting after that. I heard from a neighbor that she was trying to organize a recall election to remove the current board members, but she could not get enough signatures because most people were happy with the new policies. Someone else told me she had moved out of the neighborhood entirely, but I never confirmed it. I just stopped seeing her car on the streets. The HOA refunded the tow and immobilization fees and cleared the ledger for everyone on my list. Most of them sent me thank you messages, and a few of them said they wished they had fought back sooner but they did not know it was possible. One guy said he had been fined 3 times in 2 months for expired guest passes that were not actually expired, and he had paid every time because he thought the HOA could put a lien on his house if he did not. The board president sent him a personal apology and a full refund. The tow company lost the contract and tried to sue the HOA for breach, but the HOA's lawyer found a clause in the contract that said either party could terminate with 30 days notice for cause, and taking kickbacks counted as cause. The lawsuit got dropped. I never found out if Barbara actually got money from the tow company or if she was just lying to sound important, but it did not matter because the damage was done. I kept the tow hook chain as a souvenir. It was the chain the tow driver had been about to attach to my car that day Barbara shoved the rate sheet in my face, and after he pulled the lift away, he left it on the ground. I picked it up and hung it in my garage next to the framed apology letter. Every time I see it, I remember that moment when Barbara realized she had lost, and it makes me smile. The neighborhood is quieter now. The new management company sends out monthly newsletters with clear enforcement guidelines, and the board holds open Q&A sessions where residents can ask questions about the rules. People still complain about little things, like someone parking too close to the curb or leaving their trash cans out too long. But it is normal neighbor stuff, not the coordinated harassment campaign Barbara was running. I still see the mail carrier sometimes, and he always waves. He told me he was glad Barbara was gone because she had filed 3 complaints against him for blocking the street with his truck, even though he was just doing his job. The post office had backed him up every time, but it was still stressful. He said the new board was much easier to work with. My contractor friend came back and finished the project he had started before Barbara chased him off. He said he was spreading the word to other contractors that the neighborhood was safe again, and I started seeing more work trucks on the streets. The property values went up a little, which was ironic because Barbara had always claimed her enforcement was protecting property values. The board replaced Barbara with a guy named Tom who worked in IT and had no interest in power trips. He said his only goal was to make sure the rules were applied fairly and that residents were treated with respect. He lasted 2 years in the position before he stepped down because he got a job in another city, but by then the culture had changed and the next person who took over kept the same approach. I still have the doorbell footage saved in 3 places: my phone, my laptop, and a cloud backup. I also have the audio file of Barbara bragging about the tow fee kickbacks and the certified copy of her unpaid dues. I do not think I will ever need them again, but I keep them just in case. You never know when someone like Barbara will try to come back. The final twist came 6 months later when the HOA voted to change the covenant and add a clause that said board members could be removed immediately if they were found to be using their position for personal gain, or if they were not in good standing with their dues. The vote passed with 87% approval, which was one of the highest turnouts the neighborhood had ever seen. Someone proposed naming the clause after Barbara as a joke, but the board president said that would be petty, so they just called it the Accountability Amendment. I ran into Jessica at the grocery store a few weeks after that, and she thanked me for standing up to Barbara. She said a lot of people had wanted to fight back, but they were afraid of retaliation, and seeing me do it gave them the courage to speak up. She also said the board was working on a transparency initiative to make sure enforcement actions were documented and available for residents to review, so nothing like Barbara's campaign could happen again. I also got a call from an attorney who said he was representing 3 other residents who were considering a class action lawsuit against Barbara personally for harassment and abuse of process. He asked if I wanted to join, and I said no. I had already won. I did not need to drag it out in court for another year. He understood and said the case was moving forward anyway, and he would let me know if anything came of it. I never heard from him again, so I assume it either settled or fell apart. The custody schedule stayed intact. I did not miss a single exchange, and my ex never filed a motion. In fact, things got easier because I was not constantly stressed about the HOA, and I could focus on being present with my kid. My work schedule stayed stable, and I got a commendation from my supervisor for handling a particularly tough call during a multi-vehicle accident. Life went back to normal, or as normal as life gets when you work nights and co-parent. I still drive past Barbara's old house sometimes, and I always slow down a little, just to see if she is there. The house looks empty most of the time, with the curtains drawn and no cars in the driveway. A neighbor told me she moved in with her sister in another state, but I do not know if that is true. I hope she found a neighborhood where she can just be a regular resident and not a tyrant. The chalk marks on my tires faded after a few weeks, but I took photos of them before they disappeared. I also kept the guest pass my contractor had used, even though it was expired by then. It is in a folder with all the other documents from the fight, and every time I open the folder I remember how close I came to losing everything because one person decided to abuse a little bit of power. The tow yard closed down 8 months later, which I only found out because someone mentioned it in the neighborhood group chat. Apparently they had been running the same kickback scheme with other HOAs in the area, and once word got out, all the contracts got terminated at once. The owner tried to rebrand under a new name, but nobody trusted them anymore. I do not know if Barbara ever got her cut of the fees or if she was just bragging, but either way, the whole operation collapsed. The board sent out a final email about the enforcement review, and it turned out Barbara had authorized 43 towing actions in 6 months, which was more than the previous 3 years combined. 31 of those tows were reversed as improper, and the HOA refunded over $18,000 in total fees. The management company also found that Barbara had been using her position to intimidate residents into paying fines without reviewing the actual rules, and several people had paid for violations that did not exist. I got one more piece of mail from the HOA about a year later, a thank you card signed by the board president and all the current board members. It said, "Thank you for holding us accountable and helping us build a better community." It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. I kept the card on my fridge for a few months before it eventually got buried under other stuff, but I still have it somewhere. The neighborhood has a new rhythm now. People wave when they drive past. The board meetings are boring in the best way, just routine business about landscaping and pool hours and budget approvals. Nobody is getting towed. Nobody is getting harassed. The rules are clear, and the enforcement is fair. It is what an HOA is supposed to be, and it only took one person standing up to make it happen. I hope your next meeting is uneventful.